Hi, this is Gidon Rothstein with a short thought for Parashat Tazria-Metzora. One of the central ideas in Parashat Tazria-Metzora is the issue of tzara'at. And tzara'at appears in three forms. It can appear on a house, it can appear on clothing, and it can appear on a person. I'm going to do it in reverse order because in a weekly email I send out discussing some insights of darshanim, some of whom we'll see today, I go in backwards order because I feel like we always start with the beginning of the parsha. Those of us who were in yeshivat Acțion remember that Rabbi spent years mining the first pasuk, the first verse of each parsha for wonderful divrei Torah Friday night in yeshiva. So I'm going to do it from the end or close to the end. When it comes to house tzara'at, right, the Torah refers to it as Beit Eretz Achuzatchem, the Yakar. One of the darshanim I've been studying this year, who's Rav Ephraim of Lunchin's late 16th, early 17th century rabbi, became the rabbi of Prague at some point. He has this wonderful drush-filled commentary on the Torah called Yakar. He notices that chapter 14 of Sefer Vayikra, verse 34, refers to the idea of achuzah, of our inheritance, our possession, twice. It says, that I'm going to give you as an achuzah. And it says, in the place of your achuzah. Says the Yakar, based on the Gemara points out that that it seems likely that stinginess is a cause of house tzara'at. How do we get the idea that stinginess is a cause of house tzara'at? Because one of the things that people do when they are in the process of verifying whether they have house tzara'at is they take all of their possessions out of their house. And the Gemara says these are people who would try to avoid giving to others by claiming they didn't have anything, and then circumstances force them to take all of their possessions out of the house. So that's house tzara'at. The Yakar's additional point is the Torah stresses achuzah, our sense that it's ours, because he says that's what leads us to think that we don't have to give to others. It's because we think it's really ours. We owned it. We made it. We developed it. That's what leads us down this terrible path that will lead to house tzara'at, will lead us not to be as generous with others. If we remember that Hashem gave it to us, and I'm always reminded of how Barack Obama, when he was president, was vilified for saying at some point, you know, if you have a business, if you have this, you didn't build that. And then he said, of course I built that, which is just such an example of how, unfortunately, Western culture has become so full of a sense of arrogance and of self-accomplishment. When, of course, they didn't build it on their own. Society helps us. And as if from a Jewish perspective, Hashem helps us. Yakar says that's where we get tzara'at habayit, is from our stinginess, our thinking that we built it, our thinking that the land that God gave us, the land filled with all the goodness that God gave us, we think of it as our achuzah. Second idea, also Yakar, on the idea of clothing, he says we don't have any firm tradition as to why clothing will get tzara'at. He thinks it's because of arrogance, because he's got several Gemaras, I'm not going to repeat them all, but several Gemaras that talk about clothing as being a symbol and a model of our dignity and our presenting a picture of ourselves to the world. He seems to think that was the way people in his time made clear that they were more important than other people. We still care about fashion too. I feel like in our times there are other examples of how people try to project an image of themselves being extremely important people. One of the ways is clothing. And when we get too invested in that, too deeply thinking that we are important and we want others to know how important we are, he says that's going to be in the time when Hashem's presence is with us enough, such that Hashem can send us the messages of tzara'at, which I think are of value because we learn lessons from them. In those times, that's where tzara'at habeged would come from. Then the last little piece, the Davar, early on in the parsha, notices the halacha about the color of hair, and the hair that has to change is can be a very delicate change of color, and nonetheless qualify. The Kohen will notice it and see it as an issue of tzara'at. Says the Davar, that's to remind us that we shouldn't think that the kinds of changes in ourselves, the kinds of deficiencies in ourselves, that can lead us to incurring tzara'at, God forbid, because it's a painful and difficult experience, all of tzara'at. I said a second ago that it helps us learn lessons, that it helps Hashem send us messages. That's true, but some messages are harder to receive than others and come in a package that's not as pleasant as others. They always, if we learn the lessons, are beneficial to us, but not always easy. So he says we shouldn't think that it's only huge change. God forbid, I once upon a time, kept Pesach perfectly, and then, God forbid, the same person at some point later doesn't care about the Pesach sacrifice, eats chametz, God forbid, all of that. Shouldn't have to think that that's all that we'll do. Clear that Davar thinks the verse is implying to us that even a small change down in our personality, in our religious lives, can lead to tzara'at as well, can lead to Hashem calling us and saying, come back, which I think is an interesting idea, because we often, I think, people I know can get caught up in the question of justice and God's justice, how it works, and how such a good person can get a punishment and such a bad person might not get anything. I'm not taking on that whole big question. I think that Davar reminds us that for some people, and we have this tradition that Hashem is medactic with tzaddikim, with righteous people, like a thread of a hair. So that'll be an example of tzara'at as well. 3 ideas within tzara'at: tzara'at the house, because we're stingy and it forces us not to be, and we come to think it's too much ours. Tzara'at of clothing, because we use them too much to be projections of our great persona. And then tzara'at of the person, of the body, which can come even for small changes to the negative, not just for big, huge ones. Thank you, Shabbat Shalom, and I hope we can all learn these lessons so that when we come back to a time when tzara'at is there in the world, we're already prepared never to incur tzara'at.